Welcome everyone to Zoom into Books today. We have Julie Potter, the author of Harnessing the Power of Grief. Julie has decades of research on understanding and coping with grief, and she is a certified social worker and has coordinated spousal bereavement programs. Julie was honored to receive 2 awards from Sibley Hospital for her work and the Seabury Leadership and Aging Award in 2013. Welcome, Julie, to Zoom into Books. We're so happy to have you here today.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Kathy.
Absolutely. I would like to start today. I know we have a lot to talk about and you have some information to share on slides. How about telling the viewers today a little bit about yourself and how the story came about? And for those of you who have joined us on Facebook, if you have questions for Julie, please type them in the comments section and we'll make sure she answers those at the end of her presentation. So Julie, take it away.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Kathy. Thank you for having me, and I'm glad to be with all of you today. So I am a social worker and I practiced social work for many years in home care, nursing homes, and hospitals. And now I am retired, but for 20 years, I supervised bereavement volunteers who were themselves widowed. And I also coordinated a spousal bereavement program. And in answering your question about why I wrote the book and how it came to be, we had monthly in-service meetings for the volunteers. And at those meetings, we'd have experts talk about grief, we'd review articles and books, and I would do some training, further training of the volunteers. And when an expert brought up ideas, everyone would discuss it, but what would invariably happen would be one person would say, well, I agree with this, but not with that. And there would be disagreement about these experts in the field. And even some of the most common things that happen in training, which is, well, what types of things did people say to you that were unhelpful? And that always opens up a Pandora's box of ideas. So people would talk about all the unhelpful things that were said to them, but there would invariably be one person would say, well, I found that to be very helpful. So I came to the realization that even though there is this body of knowledge and that is very important in helping us through grief, that each one of us is unique in our grieving process. And so it is my wish in writing the book that it's helpful to you, but it's not my wish that you agree with everything that I say. My wish is that it supports you in finding your own answers and contributes to your own inner power. So today we will define grief and identify the losses that we experience in our lives, and then learn how it manifests in our lives, and then what we can do to make it through. So I'm going to start the screen now, the PowerPoint here. Okay, so here we are. The next slide. So Kathy, how does it go to the next slide?
You need to maybe page down or click on.
Great. Okay, thank you. Sorry, everybody. Okay, so what is grief? Elizabeth Alexander is a poet, and whose husband died suddenly, and she said, "We have all come through it, or we will all come to it." So it's a natural part of our life. If you're living and loving, you will be losing and grieving. So grief is a natural human response to loss. George Bonanno, who is a grief researcher and psychologist, really turned the tables on how people view grief. For a long time, it was thought that people who are grieving, most everybody should get therapy. But what he found was that actually therapy is only good for a very small percentage of people who are grieving. Most people make it through very well. And he said this: we are wired for grief. So it's natural to us. So you identify a loss, it becomes real to you. Different painful thoughts and feelings may come up in response to the loss. And I should also say sometimes joyful feelings come up also. Then you incorporate the loss into your life, and then you move forward in your life. So although my book is about death, because that's the most difficult loss that we all experience, there are many, many different types of losses. And when you read the book, you can apply what's in the book to all these other types, which I'm just going to mention a few. Loss of job, retirement, moving to a new place or a new country, loss of familiar environment through natural disasters and storm or real estate development. And I should mention, it doesn't have to be a big loss in your environment. It could be a beloved tree in your backyard. A pet dies, loss of freedom, incarceration. And even positive changes include losses. So when you get married, you're leaving the single life behind. And when you leave home, you're leaving your whole history behind. Loss of a relationship through disagreement, divorce, betrayal, abuse. All of these things are worthy of grief. Wanted to put in here also an ambiguous loss, and that is a loss that keeps evolving. So if you or your loved one or a friend might be living with a chronic or life-threatening disease, your behavior might start to change. Like if you have Alzheimer's disease or cancer, so the person that's taking care of you may see a different person every month, and they have to now come to know that new person. And also, the pandemic is an ambiguous loss, and that too continues to evolve and is causing confusion in our society. And finally, our grief itself may be a threat to others, and that is a loss of connection with that person. Someone might say to us, oh, it was God's will, or don't cry, things will be better soon. And you can feel that that is a place that is hurtful to you. So let's go here. So grief helps us to make meaning out of our loss. And the way we make meaning out of death is the same way we make it, in the same way we make meaning out of life, and that's through stories. Kathleen Gilbert, I put this quote in here, a social worker, says, stories bring order into disorder and help us to bring meaning into a meaningless situation. So we listen to stories, we tell stories, we create meaning through stories, we come to understand through stories. And think of it this way also when you're reading a story to a little child. The story is one thing, but it's really the connection between you and that child that creates the meaning. And you might have noticed that a little child will ask you to read the story over and over again. So it really is not just the story, it's the connection. I want to read you this quote by Guy Wittershoven, who's a medical ethicist, and he says, life is both more and less a story. It is more in that it is a basis for a variety of stories, and it is less in that it is unfinished and unclear as long as there are no stories about it. So I think that is really important. Let's go to the next slide here. So let's look at the characteristics of grief. Some of these I might have mentioned a little earlier. But grief is a natural human response to loss. And there's evidence that animals grieve too. Grief is love. It is love for that person or that situation who is no longer with us. Grief makes the loss real. If the loss is not real to us, then there is confusion about it. And there might even be doubt that the loss happened. So that's a very important part of grief. Grief is unique for each loss. Each one of us may go through similar things, but we bring our own unique personalities to our grieving process. And sometimes we may be surprised that we may grieve very deeply for one loss, and then we may experience another loss and might not feel that much about it. This is very normal. Grief will happen. You don't have to force it. A therapist, Dwayne Bowers, once talked to a group about this, that many times people get stressed because they feel they're not grieving, or they're not grieving as much as they should. They should be doing more. And he says that's really a problem. People get stressed about that, to really just be aware that it will happen. So as an example, you might not be crying when your loved one dies, but still there may be a part of you that is grieving. So just wait and don't force it. Grief helps you to discover a new you. This may not be a comfortable new you for a while, but it's a very important part of the grief process. And lastly, sometimes people do get stuck in their grief. However, my book is about normal grief, and 85 to 95% of people make it through grief just fine, even though it can be one of the most difficult things that we experience in life. Most of us make it through. And I do have information in the book to help you if you're worried that you might be stuck, and where you can get help. So now I'm going to talk about the experience of grief. So as we said before, it's a process of finding and creating meaning. These next two things are a little bit related, but there are some differences. So the first one is something called a dual process, and two things are happening, but not at once. So on one hand, you're grieving the loss of your loved one, and on the other hand, you're rebuilding your life. And these things don't happen at the same time. And sometimes that is a worry to people, because they might be learning new skills and be very happy that they're getting these new skills, and then worry that they're forgetting their loved one. But that's not a worry. This whole thing is part of the process of grief, the grief over your loss and rebuilding your life. And this next one is oscillation. And oscillation is where you, sort of like a pendulum, you go back and forth from grieving and not grieving. And oscillation creates resilience. And look at it this way. We may be wired for grief, but we are also wired for movement. So we can't move like an Energizer bunny 24/7. We have to have breaks from that. Maybe we'll be in a race, then we have to rest, get nourishment, rebuild our muscles. So we oscillate, and this is a very important thing in grief. Sometimes this will also worry people, that they'll have moments of joy in their life, even though they're intensely grieving the loss of their loved one. But that's really what helps to build resilience. And then reminders. There are reminders of our loved one everywhere. But when our loved one dies, then those reminders trigger a grief reaction of sadness or tears. So these reminders and grief reactions can be quite frequent, especially early in grief. And then throughout our life, there might still be reminders that come up. Teresa Rando, who's a psychologist and a grief researcher, calls them STUGs, subsequent transient upsurges of grief. And I love that. But even if you have been through a loss that was years ago, there can be a STUG that will appear, that will come from within, and then your grief reaction will come up, and then it will pass. Middle knowledge, that means you know the loss has occurred, but then you don't know it has occurred. So you know it has occurred, and then 5 minutes later, you forget that it has occurred. And this is nature's way of helping us to take in difficult knowledge slowly. And we grieve in different ways. Some people may weep when they grieve. Other people may be more contemplative and have to go inside and be by themselves more. But it doesn't mean that we're not grieving, which brings me to the very last one, which is judgment. And we tend to judge ourselves on how we are grieving. And we may also judge other people on how they are grieving. So the best thing is to suspend judgment of ourselves and others. So now we're just going to get to the nuts and bolts of grief. And this slide is about the tasks of grief. And these were formulated by William Worden a long time ago, and they still have withstood the test of time. At one point, it was thought that there were stages of grief, and you went through one stage, you finished that, it was gone. You went through the next stage, finished that, it was gone. And you went through all the stages, finished it up, pushed everything aside, and then you were back to your normal old self. Well, Worden did not see it that way. Each of these tasks of grief, he feels you can visit, you can work on. You don't have to complete them, you can just work on them one at a time, all at once, and in any order. So I think you'll see they're quite amazing. So let's go through them and some things you can do for each task. So task 1 is to accept the reality of the loss. And how do we do that? Well, the universal way, of course, is the funeral and memorial service. So a death has occurred. I know my loved one has died, and now the whole community knows this. We come together and celebrate and mourn our loss and share stories about our loved one. And then the body of or ashes of the person are taken to the cemetery or columbarium. Then afterwards, there's usually a reception. So this whole process of the funeral is symbolic of the grief process, the identification of the loss, the celebration of the life, the incorporation of the loss into our lives, and then the moving forward with our lives. That reception symbolizes that, the beginning of a new life. For some losses that we experience, the funeral can be very powerful, and maybe that's all we need in our grief process. But if if our relationship is deeper, or we're more attached to the person who died, or it's a closer relationship, the funeral is the beginning. So also cemetery visitations help with accepting the reality of the loss. Talking about your loss to others and to yourself is important. And in talking to yourself, you can journal or write about your loss, write a poem, draw a picture. Also, you can revisit task 1. And I just wanted to tell you this one example that when my mother died, I was in my 40s at the time. And then 20 years later, I was driving down the street and I saw a woman who, from behind, who was walking like my mother and looked like my mother. So I drove by her, but then I drove around the block because I thought, gosh, that was just like my mother. But I knew she had died. But as I came around the block, the woman had evidently gone into a store. But then the reality of the loss came back to me as if it had just happened, although I was a different person. I was 20 years older. I had achieved more knowledge and wisdom. So qualities of my mother that years ago might have been annoying or just I was resigned to, now, I mean, they're just part of the human condition. So I came away from that experience feeling much closer to my mother and more compassionate towards her and towards myself. So find ways also to acknowledge the unacknowledged loss. And you can do a ritual for this. For example, if your loss cannot be acknowledged, you know, maybe if a lover has died or that's a secret, or if you have had an abortion, you can just light a candle and sit with that memory for a while. And that's a very simple ritual. I don't know what there is about candle flames, but it's a powerful ritual. And also, let's just look here. This is the pandemic is a loss that is not completely acknowledged by our society. And Suzanne Brennan Furstenberg created this huge memorial. And at this point, there were 650,000 people who had died of COVID. And this is on the Washington, D.C. Mall. And many of these little flags there have inscriptions by loved ones. And you can see here, this is an aerial view of it, so it's pretty big. It's pretty big. But it is important to acknowledge all our losses because they affect us individually and as a society. So I just put Mary Kate Cranston's name here. She was part of the spousal bereavement program. And then after she was in a support group for a while, then she became a volunteer. And she wrote this little vignette about how important it was to talk with people about her loss. So here is her story. Right after my husband died, all I wanted to do was to talk about my loss. A neighbor came to the door and brought me a cake. I was very grateful for her company and I invited her in. She said, "No, I just wanted to drop off this cake for you." I encouraged her and said, "Come on in and have a cup of tea. I would love to talk with you." "No, I just wanted to drop off this cake for you." She gave a couple reasons why she couldn't stay. I tried one more time, but to no avail. Graciously, I thanked her and then bid her farewell. I desperately wanted to talk with someone. Even though I was upset, I realized my neighbor was just trying to help, but she wasn't helpful. I threw the cake out. So Mary Kate's story, I believe, really shows the importance of talking about your loss. Sometimes there might not be anybody that you can talk to. There was a study by Pennebaker where he had two groups of students right at midterms when students tend to be working hard and get sick. So he asked one group to write every day, write down some traumatic event that happened in their lives that they had told no one about. And every day for 4 days, write about that event or a separate event. It could be 4 events. And then the other group of students, he gave them more mundane things to write about. Well, the upshot was that the students who wrote about things that were very important to them and that were traumatic to them, most of them didn't go to the health center during midterms. The other group of students, the same amount went to average amount went to the health center. So he felt that that really showed how important, even if we don't have someone we can talk to, we can talk to ourselves. So what are the stories that need to be told? Mary Kate might have told the story of her husband's life, the story of his death, and her story. So task number 2 is to experience the pain of grief. And here are all of the pains. Maybe there's more, but these I think are the most important ones. So anger and fear. Anger and fear are powerful, normal human emotions. Anger helps us to right a wrong, and fear keeps us safe. But in grief, they can be, overwhelming to us. So what makes someone be angry about? So they might be angry with the doctor, the hospital. They might be angry with people who haven't experienced the same type of loss. They might be angry with themselves for not seeing what was coming. They might be angry at how condolences are offered to them. Or they might be angry that condolences are not offered and people have seemed to have forgotten about their loss. And what might people be fearful of? They might be fearful of dying the same way their loved one died, or they might be afraid they're not going to make it. They might be afraid of death. Sometimes people are afraid to do things that they used to do so easily, and now they can't seem to do those things anymore. This is all normal. So what can you do for these emotions? And one thing to do is to kind of write down the things that you're angry about and the things you're afraid of, and then write down antidotes to those. So if you're angry at yourself for not seeing the signs of what was coming, then the antidote could be, I did the best I could with the information I had. Or if you're afraid that you're going to be alone and there won't be someone there for you, the antidote could be, well, I'm going to reach out to my friends, or I'm going to make some new friends so that I will have some sense of community. Other things to do about these powerful emotions are to kind of, do other things to distract you, because sometimes you get into a rut with them. So exercising, being in nature can be very calming. Taking off your shoes and walking on the grass when the dew is there in the mornings. Also stopping thinking, through meditation can also be very powerful. I used to have a little sign in my office that said, "Stop thinking." And it was an old New Yorker cartoon that showed a harried businessman with that sign above his desk. And it did help. Another thing to do, especially with anger, is if you're thinking of any type of retaliation or revenge, it's good to talk with people about that and to really, listen to what they have to say, because that, you can feel a lot worse than you already do if you engage in that type of behavior of considering retaliation. And also fear, if you just feel so paralyzed you can't do anything, talk with others or consider getting some help for that. These are all very normal emotions, though. Let's go to the next slide here. Okay, sadness and depression. So it's very normal to feel sad in grief. And in my work, many people were worried that they were slipping over into a clinical depression. And there are similarities. And I'm just going to read you these components of clinical depression. And I think you'll see that they're pretty normal for grief. These can happen in grief. A negative view of the world, a negative view of the self, a negative view of the future, very sad, hopeless, unimportant, unable to live in a normal way. But in grief, there's a difference. In grief, a person can respond to support and comfort. You know, like Mary Kate, if that person had come in and talked with her, she would have responded to that. In grief, the sadness you experience is related to the loss, whereas in clinical depression, it's a global sadness. And this is important. In grief, you can still experience moments of joy, but not necessarily so in clinical depression. And in grief, you may feel guilt, but it's over specific aspects of the loss. In clinical depression, it's an overall sense of guilt. In grief, this may have a temporary impact on your self-esteem. You know, you're in a new world now that your loved one is gone. So the things you used to do, you might not be able to do, and you'll have to learn new things and build up your self-confidence. So that's normal in grief. But in clinical depression, self-esteem can be of longer duration. So there are differences. So the next slide is guilt and shame. And these are very important emotions in grief. But they're also important for our whole society. They're the glue that holds us together. And if you've heard the saying, if somebody does something bad and someone will say, well, he has no shame. It's very important. But our society does change. So things people were guilty about a century ago, people don't feel guilty about now. So it's not a static thing. So what can you do for the guilt that you might feel? How can you move beyond that? And early in grief, the guilt can be much more intense because you can't take back what you might have said, or you can't take back what happened. So it usually, as time goes on, the guilt and shame just diminish in their intensity. But you can also do things to move it forward. So as an example, if you were impatient with your loved one, or if you were impatient that everything was just going so slow, and you wanted to make things better, and you were working so hard, then in the future you can say, well, okay, if I'm in another situation where I'm a caregiver, I will be more patient and let things unfold as they need to. Also, you can write a letter to your loved one asking for forgiveness, and you'll be forgiven. You can also pray. You can ask for forgiveness through prayer if you're so inclined. Which brings me to the next one. This is the last one, which is spiritual pain. And spirituality is one's individual search for meaning. And we all do this. And frequently we associate spirituality with religion, but it can be associated with other groups too. But I just wanted to pick this one out since it's the traditional one. A religion is a community of seekers with a set of beliefs who celebrate holy days and provide comfort, celebration, and support through the events of life. So that's a community. And then you're also looking for your own individual meaning. So those two things go together. Sometimes you may find that your religion does not accept the loss that you've experienced. And then you may have to decide, well, do you want to stay in that group of seekers because maybe you've been with them for a long time and you care about them? Or do you want to find an additional group, maybe a support group or a meditation group, or a book club, where you could be with other people. So being alone and being with others is important. So those are the pains of grief. But I think you can also see now that with each of these tasks, they're interwoven, that there is pain in each one of them. So the next task is to adjust to a world without your loved one. I wanted to, before we go further, I wanted to read to you this poem by Faith Williams, and she's a poet. And after her husband died, she wrote this poem called The Worst Thing. The worst thing that ever happened to me was this last August when Steve died. For 54 years, I've been partly living someone else's life, and now I'm stuck in it. I feel lonely for myself. After he's gone, who am I? How will I pull myself together to find the new, real me? At 79, little bits of me stuck in the grass could be hiding anywhere. I'm not the woman he met, now so lonely for myself. I loved him. Sharing gave joy, but it's gone. So you can see in this poem that Faith is really accepting or grappling with the reality of the loss, and then wondering what is going to happen to her, and wondering how she's going to make it now. So the adjustment to a world without your loved one can start almost immediately. If it is your spouse who dies, well, then you begin eating alone and going to sleep alone immediately. And you don't think of that as a part of your adjustment. But as time goes on, there are daily adjustments that occur. And I wanted to put in here the anniversaries, which are kind of like markers in our life where we can see how we're doing and what more we have to do. So an anniversary is a recurring event commemorating and or celebrating a notable day. So the traditional anniversaries are the grand performance anniversaries. And these are the ones that we all have to do something. We have to show up in some way, either by cooking a meal or buying gifts or sending cards, something we have to do, baking a cake. So these are the ones that can be hard for people because they are full of memories. And there's also a sense of obligation with traditional anniversaries. So you can think, I should cook the Thanksgiving dinner. But if you get the word should out of there, say to yourself, I might cook the Thanksgiving dinner. And in this way, you give yourself a choice. Do you want help with that dinner? Would you like to skip Thanksgiving this year and just eat out? Would you like to go on a trip for Thanksgiving this year? You can then plan ahead for these anniversaries so that you can enjoy them as much as possible, but also that they do not overwhelm you. The second one is the anniversaries of the heart. And these are the rituals that you create together with your spouse, your friend, your siblings, with your children, colleagues, things that you just enjoy together. And they're just little rituals, like you might meet for coffee or watch a sports game together. Those are called anniversaries of the heart. And I guess I could say the only thing to do with those is to honor them and then to begin creating new anniversaries of the heart. And the last one is the painful anniversaries. And those are the ones that are directly related to the death. The date of the death, the day of the week of the death, the time of day of the death, the place of the death. And to work with those is to see them coming and then try to make a plan for them. So as an example, you could be driving down the street and know that you're coming up to the hospital where your loved one died. Well, maybe that day you'll take a different route. But on another day, you will be in the same neighborhood and you'll want to go by that hospital. You'll want to experience those memories that day. So these anniversaries are important. And what I have learned from people who are grieving, that it's a good idea to try to see them coming and make a plan. If you don't see them coming, sometimes they'll just surprise you. Now, the next one, task 4, is to embark on a new life while establishing a place in your heart for your loved one. So I want to read to you this story by Rosemary Bowen, and I'll tell you how I got this story. I was leading, facilitating a support group, and she was in it, and she told this story, and it was just a wonderful story and inspired all of us. So when I wrote the book, I asked her if I could include this in the book, and so she wrote it up, and here it is. When I went to visit my husband's columbarium at Arlington National Cemetery, I met another widow who was visiting her husband's gravesite. We struck up a conversation, and I was overjoyed to be with someone who shared my grief and experience. We left the cemetery together and spent a leisurely afternoon talking and, yes, laughing. All in all, it was a beautiful day. Here I was at my husband's final resting place, and I'd made a new friend. My meeting a new friend a year after Dave's death made me realize that I was adjusting to this terrible change. I could make a new start. During the 9 months we had hospice at home, my severe anxiety was relieved by daily visits from our devoted daughter. I cared for Dave morning, noon, and night. Chemotherapy took its toll. When I left for an errand, I was acutely aware of his state of mind without me. This was unlike both of us, who had been so devoted to each other, yet independent. His illness bound us together in close proximity. I now live in a high-rise. When I go out on my balcony and see Arlington Cemetery in the distance, it gives me a warm feeling to know that I'll be joining Dave again. How blessed I was to have him. So this is a beautiful story. And as you can see, she really is still actively grieving. She's at her husband's burial place, a columbarium, but she is also making a new friend and is experiencing some joy, and she is grateful for him being in her life. So this brings me to 2 sentences by grief counselors. One of them is Harold Ivan Smith, and he said, "You have to love them in their presence and in their absence." And John Jordan says, he's a psychologist and grief counselor, "Your job is not to let go, but to find a new way of holding on." So the relationship does not end, it changes. In task 4, you can use turning points as remembering points. So maybe your birthday can be a time to remember your loved one, and then also celebrate yourself and how you are doing. Try new things and do the same old things. So that's very important to kind of give you the comfort of the things you used to do, and then trying new things. Be open to experiences of the deceased. Those experiences are those serendipitous things that happen just out of the blue that really bring to mind your loved one. Just be aware of those. I guess I could say that experience with my mother was one of those serendipitous events that really touched me and got me to thinking. So those are the tasks of grief. So I wanted to put this slide here. This is a little snail, and as you can see, he's looking into a little bit of water that seems to be flowing over some sort of wooden peg, and he's gazing at himself. So it's good to talk with yourself. And then the other thing is to be with others. And here are two little beings sheltering in place. So we're all alone in this, but we are together. So put the book up here at the end to also just tell you a little bit how it is set up. That I certainly would love it if you'd read it from cover to cover. But for myself, when I read grief books, I prefer reading about the issue that I'm interested in and then putting it down, and then picking it up at another time and looking up another issue that I'm thinking about. Otherwise, it's just too overwhelming. So you can read a chapter of interest or just the chapter summary. There's summaries at the end of each chapter just to give you an idea of what's in there and would you want to pursue it. And then finally, the last three chapters are very short. One of them is called Tips and Validations, and it's just little pick-me-ups for those days when you might feel really down, and to also validate what you are doing. That can also be so helpful. And then the other chapter is danger signs to watch for when you might be in over your head and might need to think about getting extra help. And the last chapter is how to help. And what I have noticed is people, when they come through grief to a place of comfort, feel they have achieved so much and have gotten so much knowledge and wisdom that they want to share that with others and they want to help others. And so I put a chapter there so that if that, is something that comes to mind for you, you can look at that. So that is the end of my presentation. I'm going to stop this share now. There we are. So now I'm back to Kathy. Hi, Kathy.
Thank you so much, Julie. That's a powerful book. I know I'm going to be getting a copy. You've covered so many touchstones, and I think the way the last couple minutes when you said, read the part that affects your life, that's very sound advice. Early in your talk, you talked about normal grief and I guess not normal grief. Can you address that just for a minute or two?
Okay, so normal grief is the grief we all, 85 to 95% of us experience. And it might feel abnormal. We might feel very alone and sad, powerless even though it is a very powerful experience that we are going through. But most of us make it through just fine. The other type of grief, it's not called abnormal grief, but it's called complicated grief. And that can be like PTSD, that people who have experienced trauma can go through that. Or even in normal grief, there can be some traumatic part of the loss that will affect us deeply. This type of the complicated grief, if you find like years later that still the loss feels to you as if it just happened yesterday, that's really a sign that it's a complicated grief, and it would be good to reach out for help. And there's a lot of help for PTSD, and that's the grief where you just can't stop thinking about your loss, and you might even act upon it in a way that is antisocial, by lashing out at other people. And there's a psalm written by Frank Ogberg that helps people with PTSD. And the one part of the psalm is, although I will never forget, I need not constantly remember. And I hope I'm saying this correctly, but that's part of his thing, is to help people realize they're always going to remember this, but they don't have to remember it constantly. And so anyway, I hope that answers your question.
Yes, it does. And I hadn't thought about PTSD, which is a very real thing. Our time has come to an end. I would like to remind people who have been watching that if you came in late, this video will be on the Zoom Into Books Facebook page, and you can go back and watch it anytime. And in a few weeks, it will be available on the Zoom Into Books YouTube channel. And I have posted links in the Facebook comments to Julie's website. It's Julie Potter, thepowerofgrief.com. And if you want to get in touch with Julie, she does do speaking engagements. Is that right?
Yes, I do. Yeah.
Good. And she'll do them in person when she can, and virtually until that time. So if you, her book is available on Amazon and through her website. So please reach out to her. I think, Julie, you have imparted a wealth of information that can help a lot of people. And I know with the tough times we're going through right now, this kind of help is very important. So I'm so glad you came on Zoom Into Books. I hope we'll see you again soon. And thank you everyone for watching.
Thank you.